Hello, hello, hello.
Hello there.
How are you, Michael? How are you?
Good.
Good, good, good.
There
You know,
I am. Can you see me okay?
yeah, I mean, you look good.
Hi, Michael. I'm Greg. So
Hi.
I will try to mediate, and I understand what format you want it to be, that you want to present and interrupt it and the questions later, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to
Yeah.
ask that
All right. Well,
everything be held till the end.
Sure, sure. I mean, if you want, I could announce that. It's up to you.
Sure, that's fine.
Paul is going to be loading the slides.
Yeah,
And,
I'm having a little trouble here with my thing, so give me a sec. My Zoom is covering my notes, and that's not good. Let's see.
just click on the Zoom, it will disappear.
Click on which?
Icon on the bottom, Zoom, just click on it, it will disappear down. Or on the top, you have the X, you have a minus sign, and click on the minimize. You see on top, just hover on top.
Yeah, I see it, but I don't see a plus or minus sign.
It's at the corner.
I'm on a laptop, not a phone.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was saying, a laptop. So where you have pictures of people like me, Paul,
Right. Yeah,
Leonid.
it's on the side. How do I get that at the top? I did this before. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's
The pictures, all you have to do is just drag the pictures on the side. Just grab them and drag them to the side. Just click on it and drag them to the side.
Okay, that just comes back. But I'm more worried about how to iconize this thing.
There's also a gallery on top. You see a gallery view?
Well, the gallery is what's on the side, not on top at the moment.
Right.
I got it to do that, but let's see. Does reactions do anything?
No, that's just, raise hands and all that stuff.
Got it. I have zoom.us. How about if I do,
so you want to put your, sometimes if you do control,
well, I did gallery view, that changed things.
Yeah.
That didn't solve the icon issue. I need to minimize this view.
Minimize, yes, exactly. On the left, on the corner, you can minimize. Hi, Louisa, how are you? Hi, Leonie.
How are you doing, Zach?
Good. Louisa's busy weekend, twice in a row, I see.
Yes, well, you've got some really great topics. That was so much fun the other day. And
I know, the Sergio, that was
bless
just,
Sergio. He did a very nice show and tell.
let me tell you.
Thank you, Greg, for all that insight you gave us on everything.
Greg is the
glad
man. Greg is helpful.
Greg, are you Greek? Are you from Greece?
Me?
Greg?
Yeah.
No,
Greg.
no. I'm from Russia.
Russia. Oh, you know so much about the Greek background.
Well, I'm a history buff. That's my
history
favorite
buff.
period.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's amazing. You weren't at the when he did Pericles, right? Were you at Pericles?
I couldn't make that.
Plutarch's, yeah. Watch the video. He'll blow.
I have to find that. I'm going to find that.
It will blow your mind. I mean, Greg knowledge is unbelievable.
Wow, very impressive.
Walking Greek encyclopedia.
And this is just an interest of yours, sort of a hobby, an avocation?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
wow, that's even more impressive. I mean, I love history.
But it's a lifelong.
But I studied it. Yeah.
It's a lifelong. So I've been studying it all the time. I took many courses,
Did you?
online courses from various colleges, from Yale, from Wellesley University. I took from Munich University. I took many courses.
Oh, so you really studied it.
Yeah. So I just do on my own. I just don't have degrees.
So you're an autodidact, as they call it, right? Autodidact.
I don't know. Maybe. Yes, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
But I'm not the only one here like that. I mean,
we have Paul that got an education in history.
Yeah, but mine is not an avocation per se. But I had to learn a lot of Chinese history because I have a master's in Chinese studies. But I had to study it. Right?
Right.
It's not that
we'll-
not that I had to, that I was an avocation.
We will come there as well. I mean, when we talk about money, so maybe you can give a little synopsis
I
on.
can make that. I can't make that one. I'm sorry, Zach.
Oh, okay.
I could send you some information if I can find it, but I didn't actually study money. So I could find some.
Maybe you were Chinese in a previous life. I
No,
was,
I like to think I was from Florence. I don't know why.
Florence, yeah.
I think I was
love-
either
by the
Greek
way-
or Roman.
By the way, Luisa, we actually had somebody express an interest in do a Florence. If you're interested in doing that, let me know.
Maybe I would.
Yeah, because people are so interested in
Specifically Renaissance?
Renaissance. Yeah.
Renaissance.
Mhm.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
Renaissance. That's the most wonderful time there.
Right. Yeah. I
Vene-
thought so.
Venetian.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, hello.
It's Bev, Beverly. And
Hi, how are you?
I thought a lot about yesterday's presentation
Uh-huh.
and the role of women in Sparta. And I thought about the fact that once the three major religions of the world predominated the world, the role of women certainly took a turn very different from the lives of women living in Sparta.
Yeah. 1 second. Let me just take care of the technological things. Paul, you are allowed to share. And if anybody can also help Michael, he's trying to pull up his notes.
No,
and he
no,
doesn't
I've got them now, Zach.
Okay, got it. No problem.
Can you see me now?
Yes, I can see you really clear.
Good.
Like I read, you look good. All right. And
So, Michael, tell me when you want me to start the slideshow.
I will. I mean, you can put up the first one, right away, just the title. Yeah, I'll cue you.
Yeah, we usually wait about maybe 7 minutes, for everyone together.
That's
if
fine.
that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that.
Yeah, let's do that. You know what? I'll start you off. I'll make the announcement about the format.
right.
I'll ask people to put a question on chat. I think that would be the most, and then I'll look through them, so that if there are a lot of people, we don't want people talk over each other.
Today we're expecting 30 people. You see, Michael, how much everybody likes you?
Uh,
30 people,
Well,
my friend.
30.
If it's likely
It
by the
means
end.
maybe 18 would show up.
Oh,
I think.
Mr. Pessimistic, stop.
We'll see if
Oh.
it's likely.
That's been my experience. That
No, we actually been getting a good turnout on the weekends.
we'll see.
Hi, James. How are you?
Oh.
Hi, Andre. Leonida said hi.
Mikhail, yeah. Hi, Mikhail.
Another James. How are you? All right. Yeah.
Hi.
Yes, Jim.
Thanks for joining, guys. I appreciate that. I mean, I've announced that maybe people back to back, so we'll see. But yesterday we had a interesting one on Sparta.
Yeah, how did
And
that
we were
go?
just-
I
Oh
missed
my
that.
God! I actually put it on YouTube, so it's ready.
It's on there?
Yeah, it's on there. Let me tell you, Sergio and Aaron,
Yes, Sergio was a lot of fun.
they blew
Aaron was great.
the roof of the house, my friend.
Sergio
was
wear
very-
his long johns?
No, he was wearing.
The tunic.
No, it was a
But he
cape.
did wear the robe. I forget the name of the robe.
Cape. It's a cape. Yeah.
Cape. The
Yeah.
cape.
Okay.
Show us the cape.
Why are we starting at 3 today, not at 4?
Well, the time moved, my friend. I'm just kidding. No, it's Michael. Michael had requested that we start. So sometimes you guys, if you have a request, let me know. Okay,
Okay.
I'm not. I'm easy. So, and
So the
however,
links are on
what?
the-
Yeah, that's fine, just curious.
Okay, yeah.
Zach, the link is on the meetup site?
Yes.
Yes, it's
Yes.
on the meetup side. Right? Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that's
I-
how I got in.
Oh, you already watched it, right?
No. Oh, I'm talking about the link to this.
No,
presentation.
I'm talking about because I had to miss yesterday's
Oh,
presentation.
Yeah, you're in for a treat, my friend. This was really amazing.
Could you give me a glass of water?
Sure. Well, you want me to bring it, Beryl? Oh, I'm just kidding.
just pass it over the internet.
No problem. There's soon probably going to be an ability to do that.
We're now serving in the cafe.
I'm waiting for holographic computers. I think that'll
So,
be.
Michael, just to give it an introduction, would you be able to introduce yourself, how you connected to this paper, or what are you doing today, and so all that jazz. Go ahead.
Well, about a dozen years ago now, I began seriously studying the English Revolution and this whole period. And the more I got into it, the more I found I had to go back in English history to find, answers to questions that, you dig into something and then you have to go further and further because everything relates. I don't know, maybe about 5 years ago, a little less, 4 or 5 years ago now, I actually began to write, and I now have a manuscript on it. So this presentation is a very high level skim of that manuscript.
Okay, excellent. And
Is it
then-
available for reading?
I'm sorry?
Is it available for reading? Your manuscript?
No, not yet. I've sent it to a couple of publishers, but so far no luck.
Okay.
Oh, by the
if-
way, we do have a publisher here, Jeff, and I can reach out to him as well. He
I'm
does.
grateful for any information, support,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, Jeff has been actually looking for all of us to write some kind of history stuff, but
Well, I've got
we're
one
not.
ready to go if I could just find somebody to look at it. And
I'll put you in contact with him.
that'd be great.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
no problem. And so let me know, Paul, if you want to pull up at least the front page. We'll give it another 4 minutes, but at least people can see the presentation. Also, Michael, I know you're going to get into it, but in summary, what led to the civil war, so to speak? I mean, at least in the beginning, what
I'm
was
gonna
the
talk about
precedent?
that. I'm going to
Okay.
talk about that right off the bat.
Okay.
So let's
Okay, gotcha.
do that.
Okay, sure. We'll just have a few more minutes and then we'll start. I'll announce.
Right. We have some new
format.
people today. We have Bruno. How are you, my friend? I think you came to yesterday's meeting.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Bruno, I'm from France, and I'm studying English and so English history, British history, so that's why I'm here tonight.
Excellent. And welcome. Where are you in France? Paris?
Oh no, I'm in the center of France near Limoges. I don't know if you know it, but it's mostly countryside.
Oh, okay. Nice, very nice. Welcome. We have a couple of people from France on and off logging in. We've become international. I mean, just consider that we've been on Zoom since March. That's quite an achievement, not even a year, and we get good turnout, international turnout of people from all the United
So
States.
yes, and I said to myself, that's for me, that seems very interesting and specific, so let's go.
Exactly. Well, at some point we'll do War of Roses. At some point, not now, but obviously.
I just watched a documentary about that, and I just studied that period, so that's exactly is what I'm doing.
About War of Roses.
Yes.
There is a English writer, Con Igulden, who is fantastic, first-rate writer of historical fiction, and he wrote trilogy about the War of Roses, and it's a most thorough. I mean, he took very small liberties this time because earlier in some other series he took huge liberties with history, but this time just the small liberties. But he really described it, and it's a fiction, but a lot of historical. I would highly recommend. If you look by his name, Con Igulden, he is fantastic. I've enriched my understanding of War of Roses immensely.
Okay. Thanks for the information. I will look it up.
Yeah, very nice. And I mean, Greg has also pointed. There's a Netflix show called Barbarians, so please look at it. It's amazing. I actually looked at a couple of episodes. It's crazy amazing. It's about
only 6 episodes.
Yeah, it's about Arminius, and we all know.
Armin the German.
Yeah.
To Teutoburg forest battle when the 3 legions of Romans under General Varus was destroyed.
Quintilius Varus, where are my legions?
Right. But that one took a lot of historical liberties, but it gets the picture pretty much.
Well, we don't know, right? I mean, they're really talking a lot of what's going on in barbarian camp. We don't know any of that stuff. So.
Yeah, you have to sometimes imagine things to give a full picture, because a lot of information we think, and it's okay if you want to make a drama out of it, as long as you the overall picture correctly. I think it's okay to make up some stuff.
So
Yeah.
maybe-
One of the biggest liberties there is that the Varus was a
hey,
father
let
figure.
people watch it. Let people watch it.
No,
all
I'm
right?
saying he was a father figure for Armenians. That is the liberty, because that was not so. They have not, they didn't know each other before they met.
All right, I think we can slowly start, I guess, Michael.
Okay, all right. So yeah, we have, as per Michael's request, we're going to have a little different format than usual. Michael will present uninterrupted for about like an hour and a quarter.
Yes.
And then I think because there may be more people here, the best way would be if you could post your question on the chat, and I will look through that. I will look for them, and we'll ask them, or we'll ask the author to ask them, and that way we will have some semblance of order, and also we'll try to limit one question, like the up to 4 minutes discussion on that question, and just go to the next one. So if that's going to be okay with you guys, so please keep in mind, you could keep posting on the chat during the presentations, and when it's finished, I'll return to them, and when things come along. And also, you could also raise hands if you want to speak. That if you go to the participants, and that's where there is a option to raise hands. So I'll keep that in mind. Well, I will kind of mediate it after. So without anything, Michael, you'd like to add to this?
No, just welcome to everyone. And we should have about 45 minutes at the end for discussion, comments, questions, anything people want to raise.
Okay, go ahead.
We should mute everybody because it's some noise there.
Yeah, I think, everybody please mute yourself for now.
Okay. Well, I'm Michael Sturza. For some reason, my last name isn't showing up this time. So welcome. Paul, would you put the next slide up, please? Okay. Paul? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Conventionally, the modern era is dated by historians as beginning with the French Revolution. But 150 years earlier, the English Revolution played out along very similar lines, but with some important differences. The issues king and parliament fought over were what we today call democratic rights. They would eventually be codified in the initial amendments to the US Constitution. Their origins, however, stem from the events here in the mid-17th century. To contemporaries, the changes that occurred seemed as if the world had been turned upside down. The 1641 to 42 revolution in London and the Civil War which followed were most basically caused by the disjunction between the growing capitalist economy and the feudal social and political system. The central political issue was the struggle against monarchical absolutism. The Stuart dynasty's attempts to consolidate its absolute rule over a changed and changing society, and its failure to do so where the monarchies of Spain and France succeeded, reflected specific factors of England. So let's look at some of these. Next slide, please, Paul. Firstly, there is Parliament. The idea originated in the 1215 Magna Carta, Article 61, for a council of barons elected by themselves to enforce the Charter's provisions. Near the end of the 13th century, it became a reality. And in 1341, landed gentry and town burgess met in a separate House of Commons. Later monarchs gave formal acknowledgement of Parliament's control over finances. No tax could be imposed without the landowner's consent, especially on the landowners themselves. The aristocracy used their power in the state to block the development of a royal standing army and central bureaucracy. This kept the crown dependent on them to enforce its policies. Parliament thus achieved a certain measure of independence that attenuated the monarchy. Other historical events. In the mid-14th century, plague wiped out between a third and a half of the English population. The resulting labor shortage gave leverage to peasants who demanded to be paid for their services rather than rendering them as feudal obligations. The 1381 Peasants Revolt was a short but enormous rebellion, and it led to the dying out of villanage or serfdom over the next few decades. Freed from labor obligations to the lord, the peasants could now sell any surplus they were able to produce. Market relations spread in the countryside. At about the same time, the wool trade to the Low Countries began, and many nobles turned to raising sheep for income. In the 15th century, the Civil War of the Roses severely weakened all of the noble houses. Henry Tudor seized the throne in 1585. He soon established the prerogative court of Star Chamber to increase the power of the central state. As the price of English wool in Flanders rose, aristocrats began enclosing their land to raise sheep on a larger, more efficient scale. Small tenant farmers were simply thrown out. Some took to living semi-legally in the forests, but most migrated to villages and towns looking for work at pitiful wages that were considered no more than slavery. This created an immense underclass of desperately poor, unemployed people who were subjected to vicious repression by the law. This process of converting dispossessed peasants into wage workers would slowly continue for the next 300 years. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk about Puritanism, which is a fascinating topic in its own right, but is also often a source of confusion. It began as a minority tendency in the established Church of England. On the continent, religious reformation was supported by popular movements. But in England, Henry VIII's Reformation was a top-down affair by the government, which subordinated the church to the secular authorities. Henry sold, or made gifts, of estates from confiscated church lands to new nobles and gentry. This gave them an economic stake in Protestantism. Confession, penance, absolution, and indulgences were abolished in the new church, but otherwise practices changed very little under Henry. Services were still conducted in Latin, for example. Elizabeth's religious settlement was still largely a conservative compromise between Catholicism and Protestantism. The Church of England was still ruled by a religious hierarchy under the bishops, episcopacy, and had a judicial church structure that inflicted penalties for sinful living and non-compliance. Puritans were alert to the dangers posed by the Catholic monarchies of Spain and France, and behind them what they called the Antichrist in the Vatican. They wanted a thoroughgoing reform of the English church to make it fully compliant with Protestant precepts. At bottom, Puritans were simply Orthodox or consistent Protestants. But Puritan was an ambiguous term. There was no single manifesto or codified set of principles that defined it. There was a spectrum of opinions derived most heavily from John Calvin, but also from other European theologians. In general, Puritans emphasized preaching over prayer and ritual and opposed the collection of tithes, which was much hated. The admonition for a godly life emphasized education, thrift, accumulation, and the dignity of work. Values corresponding to profits from capitalist investment and entrepreneurship. This work ethic also served to instill discipline in the labor force, much of which was used to living in the countryside by the weather, rather than the regular rhythms of an industrializing society. Originally a religious designation, Puritans' active opposition to the policies and authority of the church's episcopal hierarchy, including the crown at its head, quickly gave it political overtones. They played an active role in electoral activity, opposing town oligarchs, and challenging the lower classes to think for themselves. By the time James I took the throne in 1603, Puritanism had had a general influence on English society. It was a trans-class movement, most popular among the petty bourgeois middling people, artisan craft workers, small shopkeepers, and domestic traders. But many merchants and gentry, and even a few noblemen, were also more conservatively adherents or sympathizers. So now to economics, economic factors. During the reigns of Elizabeth and James I, there was a great increase in economic activity. Large industrial projects were undertaken, such as draining swamps, providing their investors with substantial profits, thus their claim to do well by doing good. Numerous manufactured products for home consumption came onto the domestic market. New crops were planted and factories built. Coal mining was modernized, vastly increasing production. There was a steady inflation of prices. This benefited peasant producers at the expense of their landlords and forced many landlords, including the monarchy, to sell land. Traditionally, tenants paid low rents on long leases, a consequence of the 14th century peasant class struggle. Those gains now became under attack by landlords. Peasants who raised livestock could weave cloth at home, which they sold weekly to a domestic trader. This gave them greater economic security. Cloth and clothing were England's largest export, and centers of textile manufacture grew up in different parts of the country. Foreign trade expanded to Russia, the Mediterranean, Persia, and the East Indies. There was a large demand now in England for imports of silks, spices, currants, and wines. Trading groups, such as the East India Company, were given royal charters for monopolies in overseas trade. The merchant princes controlled town governments through self-perpetuating oligarchies, and they in turn provided financial support to the monarchy through customs duties, loans, and gifts. This made each dependent on the other. Businessmen of the London guilds, called livery companies, served as moneylenders to nobles and gentry, who were often indebted to them for large sums. The titled peers were mostly no longer a military caste with private armies of thugs at their command. Nobles and greater gentry invested in overseas trade, urban building, mining, and industrial ventures, unlike in France and Spain. But they kept their distance from any personal involvement. Middle gentry, however, compelled by the inflation, looked for ways to rationalize their country holdings through enclosures and other methods. They were more willing to take an active managerial role in manufacture or trade, and this gave them a foot in both social systems. As landowners, they were still junior members of the feudal ruling class, but now many also had direct stakes in the money economy. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, England was an economically capitalist country, despite the large majority of the population still engaged in agriculture. This increased Parliament's leverage in government. As money replaced land in importance, Parliament's power to authorize funds became a major detriment to the monarchy. The growing wealth of bourgeois elements and improving gentlemen led them to demand greater political power in the state. Under Elizabeth, the trained bands were set up to help protect the nation in case of invasion. Able-bodied men in each parish were mustered annually to be drilled and instructed. Caches of weapons were established around the country, kept under lock and key for use in an emergency. The good times came to an end in 1618 when depression hit the English textile trade. The 30 Years' War broke out on the continent the same year. This caused debates over religion and foreign policy in the church, the Privy Council, and Parliament. And there was renewed political activity by Puritans. The government retaliated with measures to repress dissent. But the ongoing controversies caused an increase in the number of parliaments called during the 1620s. Many disputed elections were referred to the House of Commons, which usually settled them to the benefit of the voters. This had the effect of widening the franchise. Next slide, please. In 1625, James died and Charles I, a devoted feudalist, came to the throne. He promoted conservatives in the Church of England, known as Arminians, who upheld the divine right of kings. He openly favored Catholics at court and in the government, and in 1626, he banned Calvinist teachings. These moves increased fears of popery within the ruling class, among nobles and gentry. Unable to get funds from Parliament, Charles ordered a forced loan. 21 Puritans, 15 of them knights, refused to pay and were imprisoned, along with a number of officers and members of the livery companies. In 1627, the Five Knights court case was a request for a writ of habeas corpus for release from prison. It was denied. The judges ruled the king could imprison men without cause. The following year, Parliament passed the Petition of Right. This document invoked Magna Carta, reasserted Parliament's control over taxes, upheld habeas corpus, and declared arbitrary imprisonment illegal. It was the first programmatic statement codifying protections for Parliament and the subject against the powers of the feudal monarchy. Its passage was celebrated in the streets of London. Charles approved it in order to obtain money, but the following year, he suddenly dismissed Parliament and refused to call another one for the next 11 years. This period is known as the personal rule. Laws against Catholics were suspended, Puritans were purged from the church, and unauthorized religious activity was persecuted by the Arminian Archbishop, William Laud. Puritan preachers and congregations were driven underground, and some were forced to emigrate to Holland or America, such as the Pilgrims. Charles promoted monopolies and other economic distortions, attempted to reinforce social rankings, and repeatedly attempted to illegally impose taxes without benefit of Parliament. In 1635, he ordered the collection of ship money, and this is always cited as one of the cardinal examples of this. Traditionally, it was an extraordinary tax raised from coastal areas for their defense at times of imminent danger. Well, there was no threat of invasion, but Charles imposed it far inland and on an annual basis. London aldermen enforced its collection. They imprisoned those who would not pay, authorized the seizure and sale of household articles of refusers. This provoked enormous opposition from all social classes, especially the gentry. 2 Puritan nobles and several Atlantic merchants refused to pay. A 1637 court challenge against it upheld the king. But the following year, London's sheriff refused to collect it, and each succeeding year brought in less money than before. But the many attempts to levy taxes without Parliament's consent called into question the very existence of Parliament in the state. In 1637, the first Vatican representative in nearly 80 years was received at court. The same year, Star Chamber convicted 3 Puritan preachers of sedition. They were sentenced to having their ears cut off, cheeks branded, and imprisonment for life. The following year, the activist John Lilburne was sentenced to be publicly whipped through the streets of London, pilloried and imprisoned. Next slide, please. Now we come to something that is not very well known. It's a very important factor, and it's not even very much discussed in the literature. But during this reactionary period, an historic change took place. In 1624, the monopoly Virginia Company collapsed. Suddenly, anyone with the means could now import tobacco under the rough and ready conditions of free trade. Charles had appointed a royal governor to the colony in the place of the company. This opened opportunities to urban and rural middling class entrepreneurs who had heretofore been excluded from the great trading routes. The new Atlantic merchants made fortunes. They traded in provisions to Virginia and the Bahamas, aggressively attacked Spanish ships and ports in the Caribbean, and increasingly interloped on the monopoly company's preserves. Most essentially, unlike the older merchant princes, they were not beholden to the king for their wealth. During the 1630s, they helped Puritan nobles and knights to establish colonies in the New World for Puritans escaping the Arminian persecution. They had wide commercial and personal contacts with middling-class businessmen in the London livery companies. As the crisis of the old regime intensified, they became Puritan political leaders in London. They would come to provide Parliament's financing and administrative organization before and during the Civil War. And they would be the biggest beneficiaries of its outcome. They were, in short, the bourgeois vanguard of the English Revolution. Okay, now things in England are really starting to heat up. In 1637, Charles ordered the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer be used in Scotland. Scotland was dominated by a strict form of the Calvinist Presbyterian Church, or Kirk. The first reading of the book in Edinburgh's cathedral caused a riot. Next slide, please. The Presbyterian nobles promulgated a new national covenant in the church, in the Kirk, rejecting bishops and royal control, and prepared to mobilize an army to defend it. Charles was intent on crushing the Scots, but he lacked funds. In 1639, his motley force, led by incompetent noble commanders, was forced to retreat from the border, and this ended the First Bishops' War. In England, the war against Scotland was unpopular. Puritans sympathized with the Presbyterians. Trade was slow, the war was costly, and it made the economic situation worse. Credit began to dry up. Foreign merchants and banks called in loans. The customs farmers provided large sums to the crown, but when the Privy Council demanded the London government raise new funds, it was refused. Meanwhile, unemployed cloth workers were holding demonstrations against the Arminian Archbishop Laud. In January 1640, Charles tried again. His Governor General in Ireland, the Earl of Stratford, forced the Irish Parliament to appropriate funds for an Irish army against the Scots. But the situation was pressing. Unruly soldiers marching north were feared by the populace, and if not paid, might mutiny and plunder, or worse, join in an uprising. Next slide. Unable to raise new loans for the English army, Charles reluctantly called Parliament for the first time since 1629. Convened in April 1640, John Pym, the leader of the opposition, immediately called for reforms before authorizing any funds. 3 weeks later, Charles dismissed it. Hence, it's known as the Short Parliament. A riot broke out in London against the Archbishop. Puritans made common cause with the Scots Covenanters, and there were fears of French invasion by the Queen's brother, Louis XIII. Following the quick dismissal of the Short Parliament, placards posted all over the city called on teenage apprentices to, quote, rise and free the land from the rule of bishops. In May, a mass demonstration against the Archbishop drew apprentices, craft workers, and unemployed sailors and dock workers who marched to his palace despite attempts to stop them. 2 weeks later, apprentices broke into a prison where Charles was holding a popular alderman. They failed, but he was released next day. However, a wounded protester was hung for treason. New placards were posted calling for the death of the papal ambassador. 2 Puritan merchants and a well-known clergyman were arrested for circulating a petition to the king for the return of Parliament. Some Puritan leaders had their homes searched and papers confiscated. Charles's request for 4,000 troops was refused by the London Common Council. The king demanded London aldermen draw up lists of the richest men in their parishes. 7 aldermen publicly refused in court to submit their names to the king. Stratford told the king he should hang them. In June, Charles seized 130,000 pounds in bullion from the mint in the Tower, disrupting trade abroad and causing numerous bankruptcies at home. In August 1640, the Scots army invaded England. Charles was again defeated in the Second Bishops' War. An interim treaty left the Scots army on English soil at England's expense. 12 lords petitioned the king for the recall of Parliament. In early September, a mass petition of grievances was being widely circulated in London and revealed the extent of popular opposition. Despite pressure from the alarmed Privy Council, the London government was unable to suppress it. The council now also recommended that the king call Parliament. The petition, with 10,000 signatures, was presented to Charles at York by 2 Atlantic merchants. Charles had lost the confidence of a large section of the peerage, as well as the gentry, in the financial, political, and military crisis. He was forced to call a new parliament. The 4 MPs elected for London were all parliamentary Puritan merchants. They would soon become the critical link between the London citizens' movement and the parliamentary opposition in the House of Commons, tying the two together. On 3 November 1640, the Long Parliament opened. It would govern for the next 13 years. The overwhelming majority of MPs in the House of Commons were well-to-do gentry, but the expansion of the franchise in the 1620s caused the return of a number of middle or lower gentry to the Commons, men such as Oliver Cromwell, more likely to be Puritan and somewhat more radical in their views. It's important to note, however, that almost none of the gentry were Republican, much less Democrats. John Pym and the opposition believed that by placing limits on the crown and bishops, they could make them politically dependent on Parliament and thereby control His Majesty's government. They had no intention of dismembering the established church or abolishing monarchy. The problem with the gentry's reform program was that it required agreement by the king. The MPs debated rumors of military force to be used against the people by Charles and Stratford. They impeached Stratford and Archbishop Laud. Parliament freed William Prynne and the 1637 religious martyrs of Star Chamber. A joyous crowd of 10,000 accompanied their re-entry into London, sending shockwaves through the royal court. The church courts no longer functioned, freeing the people from prosecution for sin. Puritans began to preach openly again. In mid-December, a petition with 15,000 signatures was presented to the Commons, calling for the abolition of the Episcopal State Church, root and branch. This was a revolutionary demand from London's middling people, led by militant Puritan preachers and radical Atlantic merchants. The church was mirrored and interpenetrated with the secular government, the king the head of both. The revolutionary movement was intent on smashing the power of the church and court hierarchies so they could decide for themselves how to run their religious and economic lives without interference. Few MPs supported an abolition of episcopacy, but most were opposed to the Catholicizing innovations of Laud's Arminianism. So there were 2 different programs, one reform, one revolutionary, that were in competition, yet their leaders were in a de facto political alliance. They mutually reinforced each other, creating a duel for power with the king's government. In March 1641, the Commons voted to remove bishops from the House of Lords and bar them from holding secular offices. Archbishop Laud tried to flee London secretly, but was stopped by a crowd and sent to the Tower. Charles could still dismiss Parliament at any time. The popular left-wing London MPs obtained loans for Parliament from the businessmen of the livery companies. Ostensibly to reassure potential lenders, the Commons unanimously passed a bill that Parliament would remain in session until it voted to dissolve itself. Over the next 2 months, the trial of Stratford in the House of Lords was the burning issue of the moment. But as the trial dragged on, Puritans began a petition and agitation for justice for Stratford. The king ordered the anti-Stratford petition suppressed, but the same day, a bill of attainder was brought in the Commons, condemning Stratford to death by act of Parliament. 10,000 people brought a petition to the Commons next day. It cited the laxity shown to Catholics in violation of the law and the Irish Popish army Stratford had raised, still in existence. It called again for church reform and the death of, quote, notorious offenders. The MPs passed the bill of attainder. Those voting against were denounced as traitors in placards posted up in London and Westminster. Next slide, please. On the 1st of May, the king sent 100 armed men to the Tower to rescue Stratford, but the officer in charge refused to admit them. There were discussions between the king and certain army officers to march the army in the north of England to London to suppress the citizens and release Stratford. The populace was enraged at rumors of this secret army plot and the attempt on the Tower. 10,000, mainly respectable people, demonstrated at Parliament. They shouted justice and execution at the Lords as they passed through the crowd. It was announced in the Commons that the king was bringing armed men into the city and attempting to seize the Tower, which was true. The Commons passed a protestation, a pledge to defend Protestantism and Parliament, aimed at the people of London. It initiated furious religious debates and some attacks on churches by Puritans. The Lord Mayor issued a prohibition on tumults, but a crowd returned next day, composed now predominantly of lower class mechanic folk who brought staves and some broadswords with them. Amid tensions and fears of a coup d'etat, Pym openly revealed what he knew about discussions at court to use the army against the people in Parliament. This undermined the pro-Stratford party badly, and 4 royalist gentlemen fled to the continent the next day. The army plot alienated even some prominent supporters of the king, who feared that it entailed the dissolution of Parliament and/or a move toward restoring Catholicism. The House of Lords passed the Bill of Attainder, with all of the Catholic members absent. It also approved the bill against dissolution of Parliament without its consent. Armed demonstrations began next day at Whitehall Palace. Charles, demoralized, approved the attainder. Stratford was executed, and the streets were filled with people rejoicing. The ruling class was now openly polarized. The victory had obviously been the people's. A royalist party of order began to form. The London government was rapidly losing the ability to rule in the old way. The trained bands were a citizens' militia, and many sympathized or participated with the Puritan crowds. A member of the Watermen's Guild, quote, told that he ought to be obedient to law, order, and the Lord Mayor, answered that it was Parliament time now, and the Lord Mayor was but their slave. This identification of the London population with the House of Commons was a source of strength to the Puritan middling class movement, and the seed of its eventual betrayal. The open conflict between the royal court and the Commons, backed by the artisan workers movement, began a struggle for power, raising the question, which class would rule? In July 1641, the prerogative courts of Star Chamber and High Commission were abolished. This ended the feudal government's judicial terror against the citizenry. It also provided the security, not to say sanctity, of private property. Merchants, tradesmen, or gentry no longer had to fear that judgments awarded in the common courts might be summarily overturned by the crown. The writ of habeas corpus was also reinforced. The House of Lords rejected expulsion of bishops from their chamber and the bill barring Catholics from holding state offices. To pressure them, the Commons introduced a new root and branch bill that would give Parliament substantial control over the church. This was quite different from the popular demand to abolish episcopacy, but it encouraged new activity by Puritans. The Commons took several other steps in the next months, such as investigating the overseas monopoly companies and individual London officials. Not a few aldermen who were monopoly merchants, manufacturers, or customs farmers were heavily fined or even imprisoned for their actions in previous years. Confiscated property was ordered returned to individuals. But the overseas company charters were renewed in return for large sums needed by Parliament. On religion, MPs ordered altars and rails, communion tables, candles, and images removed from local churches, and the elimination of superstitious rituals. Their orders were rejected by the Lords, who upheld established church practices. The conflicting orders caused violent disputes around the country. Collaboration between the Commons and the London movement sharply contrasted with the split between the two houses of Parliament, each of which contained minorities in sympathy with the other. In August, Charles signed a new treaty in Scotland, and the Scots army left England. This put Pym and Company in a quandary. The Scots army had been their only check on the crown. The king obviously could not be trusted with the safety of the house, much less to carry out reforms. Many MPs, however, considered the citizens' religious program to be seditious. The only way to compel the king was to rely on the Puritan middling class movement. But this risked alienating many of Pym's own supporters. For all its independence, the historic impotency of the House of Commons was here starkly revealed by its inability to effect changes to the feudal political system on its own. On the 1st of November, 1641, Parliament learned of a rebellion in Ireland. A massacre of Protestants, including women and children, had taken place in Ulster. That the Irish lords and people were retaking their lands, forcibly confiscated from them, cut no ice in England. There were sketchy reports and speculation about the possibility of Catholic uprisings or terrorist acts on English soil. Panic over popish plots raced around the country. The Irish uprising forced Pym's hand. All sides agreed on the necessity to raise a new army to subdue the Irish and relieve the Protestants. The question was, who would control it? The Commons passed the Grand Remonstrance, containing over 200 grievances against Charles's reign, by only 11 votes. It was presented to the king on 1 December without submitting it to the House of Lords. Ostensibly a petition, in reality, it was a thinly disguised appeal to the people, a revolutionary act in itself. It was widely circulated in the country. By 41 votes, the Commons next stipulated that Parliament had to approve all royal officers appointed by the king. Events were pushing the MPs towards revolution. Most were largely in agreement about the reform program, but a large minority opposed alliance with the London movement to achieve it. For Parliament, however, it was rely on the people or surrender and go home. The alliance of landed gentry with bourgeois Puritan merchants and ministers was critical, for it gave the Commons leadership good reason to believe they could control the citizens' movement, but it was a step full of risk. Demonstrations began the first week in December. On the 11th, the Commons received a petition with 20,000 signatures supporting the expulsion of bishops from the Lords and Parliament's control of the militia. The annual elections to the London Common Council took place on the 21st. The Royalists were so decisively routed by parliamentary Puritans that the council's leadership became lame ducks. 2 days later, Charles rejected the Grand Remonstrance and replaced the Lieutenant of the Tower with a Royalist officer. This provoked continuing disturbances in the city by apprentices. All shops were closed. The Commons received another petition with 30,000 signatures from the apprentices, which again called for root and branch reform of the church and declared they would fight against a, quote, royal coup. The Lords refused to take action against the new lieutenant, so the Commons passed a declaration disclaiming responsibility for any, quote, blood which is likely to be spilt. On the 26th, the Lord Mayor was forced to tell the king that he could not keep order in the city unless the new lieutenant at the Tower was replaced. The king was compelled to give in, but he wrote a proclamation banning assemblies. The next day, a crowd of several hundred citizens chanting "No bishops" went to the House of Lords. They jostled bishops, some of whose gowns were torn. The now ex-lieutenant and other officers were inside the hall, seeking back pay and new commissions. Some half dozen attacked the crowd with swords. They were driven off by John Lilburne, leading some sailors with truncheons, backed by the crowds throwing stones. This was the first actual combat between the two sides. At news of the fight, hundreds of armed people went directly to Parliament. Some apprentices were arrested and held in a tavern. The remaining apprentices attacked the tavern and freed their comrades. The House of Lords ordered the crowd to go home, forbid them to assemble at Parliament. The king issued his own proclamation to the same effect, authorizing the trained bands to shoot to kill if there was resistance. As night fell, the House of Lords was still surrounded by 10,000 people, armed with halberds and staves, carrying torches and chanting, "No bishops, no papist lords." Some bishops left secretly. Others passed the entire night in the house in fear of their lives. The crowd searched the Lords' carriages as they left to see if bishops were hiding in them. An even larger crowd appeared on the 28th and prevented bishops from landing at Westminster by river. Some apprentices were arrested and taken to Westminster Abbey to be questioned by the Archbishop of York. A large group, led by John Lilburne and Sir Richard Wiseman, went to secure their release. They were attacked by 40 gentlemen with swords and pistols. Lilburne was wounded and Wiseman was killed. Royalist reaction proceeded. The king entertained 120 officers who had offered him their services. The Archbishop of York met with bishops to discuss how to blame the opposition for mob violence. Lord Digby made a motion in the upper house that, due to the actions of the rabble, quote, "This is no free parliament." This would have invalidated the act of parliament to remain in session until it voted to dissolve, setting it up for the king to do so legally. With the bishops absent, Digby's motion was defeated by 4 votes. The day after Wiseman was killed, 29 December, an armed demonstration, including men of quality, shouting "No bishops, no popish lords," appeared early at Parliament, then went to the palace at Whitehall. Gentlemen guards again attacked the crowd with swords. The famous derogatory epithets, Cavalier and Roundhead, were exchanged for the first time. Cavalier, from the Spanish caballero, implying a Catholic mercenary, and Roundhead, meaning short-haired commoners, as gentlemen usually wore their hair long. There were reports of armed men being gathered by the king at Whitehall and Westminster Abbey, and it made clear that a new army plot was in the offing. With the king's connivance, 12 bishops complained of their de facto exclusion from the House of Lords by the crowds. The Lords forwarded their protest to the Commons. The MPs immediately impeached the bishops, and the Lords sent them to prison. Apparently, they felt provoked by the king's maneuver to dismiss them. There was public rejoicing in London. Hundreds of young gentlemen of the nobility and gentry rallied to the king and the party of order. The guard at Whitehall was increased and defenses strengthened. A military coup seemed imminent. At the king's direction, the outgoing Common Council issued resolutions on 31 December, threatening punishment to anyone causing tumults or shirking their duty in the trained bands, and a new royal nominee took charge at the Tower. Next slide, please. On the 3rd of January, 1642, the king charged 5 leaders of the House of Commons and 1 lord with treason. The king and Commons sent conflicting orders to the Lord Mayor regarding the trained bands, the king again authorizing them to shoot to kill. But the Commons also sent their orders to the aldermen and Common Council. The next day, Charles personally led a retinue of 100 royal officers to arrest John Pym and 4 other leading MPs on the floor of the Commons. No monarch had ever even before entered the House, much less with the intent to arrest sitting members. Warned in advance, the intended prisoners hid in a radical district of London. The king was forced to retreat empty-handed, making him look much the fool, if ever a more dangerous one. The entire House then voted to adjourn to London, thereby throwing themselves on the mercy of the ordinary citizens. The same day, the Common Council set up a committee of safety by order of the House of Commons. All of the councillors elected to the committee, including 9 Atlantic merchants, were all supporters of Parliament. 4 of the 6 aldermen elected to it were Puritans. Aldermen and sheriffs closed the gates to the city and placed chains across streets to impede horses. The mass of people armed themselves and stood watch in the streets to protect the 5 members. 2 nights later, a rumor quickly spread that soldiers were approaching the city. The citizens again went on alert, and the trained bands were called out without the Lord Mayor's authorization. Tens of thousands of armed men went into the streets, while women built barricades and prepared pots of boiling water to use against the enemy. The attack never came, but the determined show of force by the population and militia made it impossible for the Board of Aldermen or the House of Lords to move against them. With the trained bands behind it, the Committee of Safety, on behalf of the Common Council, was in command of the city, and the Royalists were helpless. The House of Commons passed a series of measures legitimizing the actions taken in London. The Lord Mayor's power to call out the trained bands on his own authority was removed. This codified a serious blow to the King's control over the militia. The London trained band was charged with protecting the 5 members, the Southwark band with holding the south bank of the Thames, and the apprentices with guarding the city. On the night of 10 January 1642, Charles and his family fled London. The 5 MPs and Commons returned to Westminster in triumph the next day, cheered by crowds. The anti-absolutist alliance between the people of London in arms, the Puritan merchants in the city government, and the reformed gentry in the House of Commons had been sealed. A new flood of petitions from the provinces to Parliament now began. For the next 6 weeks, thousands of people arrived in London in organized contingents to petition and pressure the House of Lords. Many petitions complained about the continuing economic depression. The country was almost at a standstill. Thousands of workers, manufacturers, and retailers in the cloth industry, and indirectly, nearly the whole population were affected. The solution to the crisis was popularly seen to be the reforms championed by the Commons, but stalled in the House of Lords. The London government officially petitioned the Lords to exclude bishops. An alderman told the House of Commons that loans from the city were contingent on this. Despite the flood of petitions and demonstrations, a majority in the House of Lords voted against the bill requiring parliamentary approval of military officers. This unleashed new demonstrations against them. A petition from apprentices and seamen of London on 26 January threatened, quote, that if present remedy be not afforded, multitudes will be ready to take hold upon that remedy which is next at hand. A few days later, hundreds of poor people marched on the House of Commons with a petition blaming bishops and papists for their poverty and demanding the names of the lords who were obstructing the resolution of the crisis. A petition from poor women was received the same day, followed next day by hundreds of women at Parliament demanding bread. Rebuked by the Duke of Richmond, the women seized and broke his staff. The Commons next received a petition from 15,000 unemployed porters, quote, and the lowest members of the city. Soon they would be forced to extremities not fit to be named, and to make good that saying, that necessity hath no law. It is true that we have nothing to lose but our lives. The Commons invited those lords in agreement with them to publicly declare their solidarity. This was, they added, their last offer. Fearing the people's wrath and new disorders, the conservatives in the upper house caved and joined in a petition to the king to put the Tower, forts, and militia under individuals selected by Parliament. On 5 February, they finally voted to exclude bishops from their house. Many lords immediately began to leave London. Next slide, please. In March, Parliament announced the implementation of a militia bill despite the king's refusal to approve it, quote, for the safety and defense of the kingdom. The bill gave Parliament the right to appoint the Lord's Lieutenant, who controlled the trained bands in each county instead of Charles. From now on, parliamentary ordinances had the force of law. Parliament had been transformed from a feudal council to an independent bourgeois institution. Political power in London had passed to the alliance of the gentry and the Atlantic merchants. The purge of bishops from the House of Lords confirmed the upper house as subordinate to the lower. The feudal political system was shattered, and England would never be the same again. In London, local electoral procedures were democratized, and disputed elections were now referred to the Committee of Safety, renamed the Militia Committee. The committee expanded and reorganized the trained bands under the command of leading parliamentary Puritans. The new men who took over running the city government did not come from great merchant families. They were liverymen who had gone into business and become wealthy. Most were Puritans or Puritan sympathizers who had not held local office prior to 1640. They were the pinnacle of the Atlantic merchants' base, but they were more broadly representative of the capitalist class than the overseas merchants, old or new. They were also generally more politically moderate than those who had led the revolutionary insurrection, and corresponded more closely to Pym's reformers in the House of Commons. They supported Parliament and reform of religion, but their main concern was for stable conditions to conduct business. There was always the unpredictable possibility that the king might return, and this caused many Common Council members to remain cautious and to favor an accommodation with the king, if at all possible. In April, Charles marched his entourage to take control of the city of Hull, where there was a large store of munitions. He was refused entrance by the governor. The House of Commons' support for the governor's action caused a general desertion of royalists from Parliament. 32 nobles and 60 MPs left London to join the king at York. In June, Parliament passed an ordinance calling on London citizens to make voluntary contributions of money, plate, or horse for Parliament's defense. This interim measure prepared the way later in the year for a full-blown tax called a weekly assessment. A majority of London aldermen, a minority of common councillors, and many city officials were still royalists, and they obstructed the Common Council majority every way they could. In February, the royalist city recorder was sent to prison by Parliament on charges dating back to 1639. In July, Parliament put the Lord Mayor on trial. Among the charges were his obstruction of Parliament's order for war preparations and his June proclamation of the King's Commission of Array, an antique feudal device Charles had resurrected to raise troops and counter the militia bill. These were openly counter-revolutionary acts. He was found guilty on 12 August and imprisoned. One of London's MPs, the popular Puritan alderman Isaac Pennington, was elected the new Lord Mayor. The Royalist Party refused to recognize Pennington. The insignias of office had to be taken from the old mayor's house by force. London apprentices and tradesmen supplied the rank and file of Parliament's army under the command of the Earl of Essex. By the early autumn of 1642, 12,000 infantry volunteers and a large number of horsemen were enrolled specifically to fight outside of London. The militia had another 10,000 men to defend the city. The officers were mostly militia committee members, and the 40 captains were overwhelmingly livery company men or merchants. The Civil War officially began on 22 August, 1642, when in the quaint feudal manner, Charles raised his standard in Nottingham, formally calling on his nobles to come to his aid with their vassals. Destruction of the monarchy, he told them, would lead to, quote, a parity and confusion of all degrees and conditions. In other words, equality. In general, the more developed south and east of England were strongly for Parliament, and the far less industrial parts of the country in the north and west of England and Wales supported the king. But even in remote areas, craftspeople and manufacturing towns were the most ardent parliamentarians. In many parts of the country during 1642 and 43, crowds of armed townsmen and peasants stopped royalists who were attempting to raise troops or seize local stores of weapons and gunpowder and ran them off. They were often joined by the trained bands. Several nobles and high gentry were arrested and sent to London as prisoners. In this way, the middling people of town and country, acting as watchdogs and enforcers, suppressed royalist activities and secured large areas and substantial weaponry for Parliament. In October, the London trained bands took a significant step. They joined the Army of Essex in the field and played a leading role in the first major engagement, the Battle of Edgehill. The battle was inconclusive, however, and convinced many that the war could not be won by irregular volunteers from the lower classes, facing sons of gentlemen trained in arms. This led to the formation of the war and peace parties in Parliament and the London government. The first wanted an aggressive policy of mobilizing godly men to fight the king. The latter became defeatist and advocated peace with the king on any terms he would accept. Both were minority extremes in the Commons. Most MPs supported an efficient and vigorous prosecution of the war, while also negotiating with the king, which the Lords in particular insisted on. Their only aim, however, was to get Charles to agree to the democratic reforms of 1641. Pym's policy was not to oppose negotiations, while building an administrative, fiscal, and military machinery that could be used to support Parliament when, as he clearly expected, they failed. Supported by the War Party in the Commons and the radical city government, he had largely succeeded by the time negotiations for a treaty with the king collapsed the following year. In November 1642, Charles's troops were pillaging and raiding a mere 8 miles west of London, even as negotiations were taking place. The trained bands again turned out with Essex at Turnham Green, frustrating a quick victory by the Cavaliers. The same month, Parliament passed a weekly assessment on London to pay for the war, and it was extended to the rest of the country in January 1643. Beginning in the fall of 1642 and continued in the spring of 43, nearly the entire population of London enthusiastically turned out to build extensive fortifications for defense around the city and its suburbs. Up to 20,000 people a day participated, organized by livery company or parish, receiving no pay, only food. They erected walls with trenches and watchtowers, 9 feet thick, 18 feet high, and extending for 18 miles. This demonstrated the large core of organized support for the program of the Revolution in church and state and its parliamentary Puritan leadership. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, a royalist minority centered in the monopoly merchant companies remained a deadly threat. While most in the London government were willing to protect the city from openly royalist influence, there was little attempt to systematically suppress it. MPs and city leaders were unwilling to mobilize the people to stamp out the threat of royalism. Such a move risked unleashing a far more thoroughgoing revolution. During the first half of 1643, as negotiations with the king floundered, Parliament failed to pass any new measures to pay or supply its armies until the military situation was almost lost. This helped feed a growing reaction encouraged by peace party agitation. High taxes and fear of war enabled it to rally support from London's population. Its influence in the London government was strong enough to block any further city loans to Parliament or provide money to pay for additional troops. Following the king's virulent rejection of a peace petition from the city and his demand that London leaders be turned over for treason, Parliament agreed on a bill abolishing episcopacy at the end of January 1643. The weekly assessments proved insufficient. In March, Parliament began sequestering royalist estates. Parliamentary committees in each county took over collecting rents until the land could be sold. It stripped them of assets for the benefit of Parliament, being careful to first pay off creditors. This eventually resulted in a massive redistribution of wealth from the aristocracy to the capitalist business class, as Parliament gave contracts to meet the needs of the war. Also in March, London's War Party leaders presented a citizens' petition and remonstrance to the Common Council. For the first time, it formally asserted that sovereignty resided in Parliament acting on behalf of the people and not in the person of the king. The radicals also called for trustworthy public officials, strict conditions of settlement with the king, and a national religious covenant. The following month, negotiations with the king at Oxford collapsed. In late May, a royalist conspiracy to admit Cavalier troops into London was exposed. Authorized by Charles, and it was facilitated by MP Edmund Waller, and it involved some of the wealthiest citizens and former common councillors. The king had very nearly struck a devastating blow from within the city itself. Soon after, news came that Charles was negotiating with Irish Catholic rebels to enlist them on his side. In London, anti-monarchist sentiment increased. In July 1643, all three of Parliament's armies suffered severe defeats. 7 counties were lost to the king, along with parts of 3 others, and Hull was under siege. The military crisis finally forced Parliament, led by Pym, to take action to reinforce and supply the Army of Essex. In late July, the Commons approved an excise sales tax, previously rejected. On the 1st of August, Bristol fell to the king. 3 days later, the House of Lords sent propositions for peace to the Commons. They included returning all forts, ports, and armories to Charles's control, an abject surrender. It posed the question of the revolution's survival point blank. If the House pulled out, the alliance of the Gentry and Atlantic merchants would be shattered. London would be left on its own, militarily and politically. The War Party vigorously argued to reject the propositions out of hand, but by 29 votes, the Commons elected to consider them. The hot debate was carried over to the following Monday. Mayor Isaac Pennington called an emergency Common Council meeting. Moderates joined with the radicals to petition the House of Commons to reject the peace proposals to the king. They also demanded an impressment ordinance to raise new troops. On Sunday, Puritan preachers denounced the propositions in church, and leaflets were posted calling on citizens to arrive at Parliament first thing Monday morning. For the first and only time since the campaign against the Lords in February 1642, the Puritan merchant leadership mobilized its base of supporters for direct agitation at Parliament. On Monday, 7 August, 5,000 unarmed men showed up at Parliament, demanding rejection of the Lords' propositions. Mayor Pennington took his seat in the House of Commons, and the London government's petition was presented. The House of Lords was outraged by the presence of the citizens creating a ruckus. They voted to condemn the demonstration and immediately adjourned. They informed the Commons that they would not reconvene until the tumult was ended. The Lords were jeered, but the demonstrators made no attempt to prevent them from leaving. Pym was firmly opposed to the peace proposals, but he was also opposed to putting the more radical War Party into power. He therefore could neither condemn nor condone the people's appearance, and this forced him to de facto rely on Pennington and the city radicals to influence events. Pennington was also in an odd and dangerous situation. Like Pym, he was simultaneously determined to prevent a surrender to the king and to preserve the cause of Parliament. But what if he couldn't? There were rumors that he intended to arrest the leaders of the peace party, but opted first to try to pressure the House of Commons. There is only a single biased source for this allegation, but it may have been true. For if Parliament gave up on the war, the only way to continue would be for the London Puritan government itself to assume leadership of the national war effort. The question was, were they in fact prepared to lead if the Commons defaulted? It would doubtless have meant a more stringent, revolutionary dictatorship in the city, one that would likely require a greater political mobilization of the citizenry. In short, the type of regime the Jacobins would implement in 1793 Paris. It took 2 votes, but the peace proposals were defeated 88 to 81. The London Puritan merchant leadership had rescued the revolution and preserved its partnership with the Gentry. But it had also, however, sidelined the war party in Parliament and its supporters among the people, and put the Gentry back in control of events. 2 days later, a violent demonstration by women demanding peace had to be broken up by the city's cavalry. The women were organized and led by a royalist noblewoman, wife of a lord who was a former gentleman of the Privy Chamber to Charles. Events demonstrated the London government's control of the city. The House of Lords passed the impressment bill for new troops next day. Essex and the trained bands relieved the siege of Gloucester and were victorious in the Battle of Newbury, but only after very heavy fighting. The contemporary royalist historian, Lord Clarendon, credited the trained band's infantry with standing their ground and saving the day. As the military crisis receded, so did the influence of the radicals and Atlantic merchants in London. In October 1643, Pennington was replaced as Lord Mayor by a moderate. This consolidated a shift that led to a long rightward political slide in the city. As the Civil War dragged on, radical Puritans in London were slowly but steadily purged from municipal government posts, opening the way towards an eventual rapprochement between moderates, peace party, and royalists. Reaction conquered the London government a few years before it took hold in the House of Commons, but the revolution was not over yet. The reactionaries' hold on London was reversed by the new model army interventions in 1647 and 48. They were spurred on by elected representatives of the army's Puritan rank and file, called agitators, who were influenced by the radically democratic Leveller Party. Charles was put on trial and executed in 1649. Down the road, the Bourgeois Revolution would be completed in 1688, defeating absolutism once and for all. But it was deeply influenced and built on the events 40 years before. Without them, it would have looked significantly different and quite possibly have been far more explosive. The early advent of English capitalism and the overthrow of feudalism opened the way for England's domination of the seas, the British colonial empire, and the Industrial Revolution to come. And that is it. Last slide, please, Paul. Anybody there? Anybody
Yeah,
awake?
okay, so, all right, so we finished this, and now, for those who have questions, could you either raise hands in the participant, you just press participant and there is an option raise hands, or post it on the chat and I will give you the word, okay? So for now, let's say, Zach has a couple of questions, so I'm gonna give him the word to ask them.
So thank you, first of all, Michael, for this. This was enlightening. I appreciate that. I mean, first of all, we're not really familiar. I mean, I'm not really familiar with the period, but first question I have, what are the fundamentals of, Puritanism? And did the settlers in Ireland from England were Puritanists, and therefore, incited a war or a civil war with Irish because they were Catholic?
Okay. Ireland is something I really need to study more. So with that, I've done some reading on it. Under James I, Catholics were driven out of Ulster, and English and Scottish Protestants were given land. I don't know what the exact terms were, but they were, it was much like when they went to America. So the war in Ireland was a rebellion by the Catholics, including the Catholic lords, against to retake their lands, presumably because they saw that things in England were kind of presented a good opportunity. By the way, at least some of them claimed that they had the authority of King Charles for what they were doing, because they saw him as like the English, and particularly the Puritans, as a not so secret Catholic. On Puritanism, I'm sorry, your question was, what are the fundamentals of Puritanism?
Correct.
All right, well, let's see. There were broadly two kinds of Puritans by 1640, Presbyterians and Independents. The Presbyterians were, they wanted a new national church, but they wanted less oversight from the government. They wanted something like what existed in Scotland, where even nobles were subject to church discipline, something that the English nobility thought was woefully democratic, and we're certainly not about to put up with. But they wanted a more control at the congregational level, but within a structure so that basically the wealthy could control the church. The Independents went further. They believed that it was okay to have a national church because they thought that, that was the only way to kind of promulgate it. But they rejected any oversight by that national church. They thought every congregation should be able to worship as it pleased and to hire its own ministers. And in fact, they also believed that even a spiritual layman should be allowed to preach. And then they would hold discussions after somebody spoke to help reinforce what they had heard. They were also more tolerant. They were open to anyone who at least was some form of a Calvinist or Reformed Christian to being allowed to worship as they chose. So this included groups like the Anabaptists, who were also they were sort of who were much smaller, but were also part of the Puritan movement. And then there were the radical sects, the Seekers, the Ranters groups, the Quakers, groups like that. Let's see here.
4 minutes passed, by the way.
I'm sorry?
We did pass 4 minutes. You wanted.
Okay, next. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. You could just round it up, maybe.
Sure. But as I said, their concepts were, Catholicism was seen as a religion for landlords who simply passively collected rents. Puritans believed people should be active. They wanted an active understanding of the Bible, of the Word of God, and it corresponded to, as I said, entrepreneurship in the capitalist part of the economy.
I see.
Okay. Do you want to ask another question?
No, let's move on to Jane and I'll come back to my question.
Okay, Jane, go ahead.
Jane? We can ask Jane's question. How much interest did France and Spain take in this civil war?
The Queen, at a fairly early point, went to the continent to raise funds and to try to get foreign kings to send troops to help Charles. She raised a lot of money. She was able to buy some mercenaries, but none of the other kings in Europe would send troops. There was, for one thing, the 30 Years' War was still raging on the continent. It was very destructive. It was over the question of religion primarily. And so they either didn't have the resources or they just couldn't afford to do it right then. It would have left them too weak.
So Louisa, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wrote it in the chat. What percentage of the population was literate at that time you're talking about?
That's an excellent.
You said a lot about print media and how that was, they were running pamphlets and stuff like that. I'm curious, what percentage of the population was literate?
You're absolutely. It's a very good question. A majority of the country of the people were not literate, but perhaps as many as about a third were. And what was commonly done was people would meet in pubs and they would read either the latest news sheets or leaflets or whatever it was to groups of people who couldn't read. This went on to a fair extent. So word got around, yeah, no, it's an excellent question. Print had become very cheap. So with the collapse of the censorship, which the church, the Episcopal Church and Laud had previously administered, there was a flood of cheap pamphlets costing like a penny. That people could buy on the streets that had addressed all kinds of different questions, religion, politics, everything you can name. There is a collection of 22,000 of these in the British Library.
Okay,
thank you.
Paul, you want to please ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. On the literacy question, my understanding is that there's a tremendous relationship between Puritanism and literacy, not between Protestantism and literacy. I mean, it was Luther's basic notion that everybody should be able to read the Bible and interpret it themselves. And he immediately published a German language version of the Bible, right? What's his name? Tilsdale under Henry VIII was persecuted for bringing forward an English language version of the Bible, and then the countries that became Protestant were the countries that experienced a mass expansion of literacy. The United States being a good example of that as well. The question that I wanted to ask, or let's say open for discussion, is the interpenetration between religion and class. So we have clearly, and you brought out some class issues here, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the resistance of the landed nobles and so forth and so on. But it's also clear that a nascent proletariat was deeply involved. I mean, these apprentices, the seamen that you talk about, the sailors, right, really reminds you very much of the battleship Potemkin. So what I'm saying is the classic Marxist interpretation of the bourgeois revolution is that the bourgeois are incapable of making a revolution themselves. They must rely on the proletariat to be their muscle, to be the ones that will actually take the brunt of making a revolution. However, the proletariat won't stop there, and they'll start pushing for their own self-interest, which is in contradistinction to the interest. I mean, these large factory owners and so forth were clearly no friends to the working man. They were the ones who, led to the conditions described by Dickens. But it seems like religion was the way to bridge that divide, right? So that this Protestantism could be seen as representing a way to paper over, if you will, the fundamental contradictions between the bourgeoisie and a nascent working class. So I just wanted to, bring that up and ask you to comment, and maybe other people want to talk about it too.
Does anyone else want to contribute to this?
Well, it occurred to me that the English Civil War, that you could say it was the British Civil War, that this was what really brought England and Scotland together as a nation with one destiny.
Okay, I'm sorry, is that a question? I'm not quite sure.
No, not really, just a comment.
Oh, okay, fine.
Anyways, the turning point came in Scotland.
Right. Okay.
I think they also divided later on over they wanted to bring Stuarts back, right?
Well, some of them.
Well, yeah. If one gets into Scottish history, we will be here all night as well.
All right.
But suffice to say, yes, there were radicals and conservatives in Scotland as well, vying for power. So I want to address Paul's comments because they're really very interesting and important. So I think, Paul, that you're a little bit collapsing two different ideas. That the working class can only be the agent of revolution, and the bourgeoisie cannot, is only applicable in Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution for underdeveloped countries.
Well, let me just say that Marx, on his writings about the 1848 revolution,
yes,
his writings of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, he makes that point again and again and again, how in 1848, the workers came out in the street, the bourgeoisie got the shit scared out of them and fled and allowed the workers to be hung out to dry. So it's not something that's dedicated to Trotsky and this idea of a backward peasantry and his notion of combined and uneven development.
But that was in the 19th century. We're
talking
about England 200 years earlier. You don't really have a proletariat as such. There are wage workers, but they are not in any, there are no trade unions.
Right, but you have these, how would you classify the artisans and the apprentices?
Yes, and they're not, strictly speaking, a working class in the modern sense, or a proletariat in the modern sense. They are petty bourgeois. Now, much of the work they do is laborious, but that's not the same thing. And it wasn't the same thing for Marx or Trotsky. So, I mean, their analog in the French Revolution is the sans-culottes, who again were a petty bourgeois militant layer. Sort of, yes, you could kind of call it a proto-working class, perhaps. But it's not exactly the same thing as a modern day proletariat. You don't have mass industry. You have to understand that industry as it existed, for the most part, was simply small manufacture. There there wasn't, you know, and a master might have a workshop, maybe with half a dozen to a dozen looms.
Well, let me just comment on that for a second, because I think the development of industry, one of the effects of it was to drive this artisan class down into the working class.
Oh, yes,
Right?
absolutely.
It was to remove the need for skill, right?
Sure.
And to allow more manual, and so what I'm saying is that I still am maintaining that this artisan class, they worked with their own hands.
Yes.
And they were not rentiers, they were not capitalists, they were not petty bourgeois in the sense of being shopkeepers and bakery owners or things like that.
They were petty bourgeois in the sense that they had their own shops. They had their own workspaces. This is not mass industry or assembly lines. It's not the same thing. When a shoemaker sits there and makes a pair of shoes, he's a petty bourgeois. When he's slapping heels on an assembly line, he's a worker. And it took 200 or 300 years to transfer from of social evolution to get from one to the other.
Okay, so we'll.
We're talking this is the early 17th century. It's a much more embryonic stage of capitalist development, of manufacturing development in particular.
It was your words to say that this was the beginning of capitalism. And
no, what I said was that that by 1600, England had become an economically capitalist country, because the trade, the cloth trade, and cloth trade abroad, and the manufacturing of cloth in England that supported it, had become so large and important to the economy that it dwarfed the input of agriculture. And the proof of this, of course, is the depressions that occurred, and set England back.
My point is that specifically industrial capitalism creates the working class.
Industrial capitalism does create the working class, but before
it creates, that's why I said it was a nascent proletariat. But I'm saying that you had basic interests which you could, march forward and see how they developed. Certainly, you didn't have an industrial working class. Certainly, you didn't have anything that was capable of socialism or anything like that, right? But you did have people who had an interest that was profoundly different from the Atlantic merchants that you described.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And they were the ones that would come out and fight. The Atlantic merchants were sitting back and, importing tobacco.
Yeah, my whole point about this, in this talk, is that it was this class, the so-called middling class, the artisans and the small people involved in capitalism, who were not great merchants or even well-to-do liverymen, were the driving force of the revolution, not the gentry. So it's their role is what's usually left out of most histories about the Civil War.
Right.
And why I wanted to focus so narrowly on this particular period, because it's not, you don't find it very much anymore. You don't even find it, for instance, very much in the works of Christopher Hill.
Who were their political leaders?
Their political leaders were people like Hugh Peter, who was an independent Puritan divine, and Isaac Pennington, who was he had been an overseas merchant, modest one, and owned two breweries in London when he became when he was elected to the Long Parliament. Trying to find something here.
Was Cromwell part of this rebellion as well, or?
Well, he came to play a very pivotal role.
Right. He's an interesting
but
character.
He was a member of the gentry, lower gentry. He wasn't, you know, I don't know exactly. I saw something recently, I think said he had about 300 pounds a year. There were periods that he was poorer, but he came from a sort of poor relations of a well-to-do gentry family. His mother ran a brewery or a still for a while.
But he inherited a lot from his uncle, right? I mean, he contributed that to God, saying that since I'm Puritist, right, or so to speak, right, this is God's way of giving it to me. But what's interesting, I mean, everybody was, also referring to literacy. I mean, their big point of Puritanists is also we're carrying this pocketbook Bibles, right? And so to speak, right? So we can talk to God directly. We don't need any of this, clergymen to.
That was Luther's great contribution.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. If I can just throw this in, here's a quote that I happen to have from Marx to this issue that we were just talking about. It so happens that the social questions which have been dealt with in our own day increase in importance in proportion as we leave them behind us, the realm of absolute monarchy. Socialism and communism did not emanate from Germany, but from England, France, and North America. The first manifestations of a truly active communist party is contained within the bourgeois revolution. And that's my point. This is a bourgeois revolution. It's not a socialist revolution. That is something down the road, a couple of centuries after the Industrial Revolution sucked up all of these people who were tramping all around England because they couldn't find employment. They were homeless and unemployed. And that had been going on for decades, if not, many, many decades. So we have to have, there's a sine wave here in a sense. So we have to, we don't want to collapse our categories too badly.
Michael, I have a question.
Sure.
Like we have here in the United States, Senate and House of Representatives, that's kind of like a reminiscent of House of Lords and House of Commons, right? So I'm kind of curious, what is there, and we see how the powers are shared between these two chambers, and I'm curious, how is it shared in the Parliament of those days? Because it seems that House of Lords is kind of for the king, but then things changes. But what are the powers they have? How come House of Commons could, overcome resistance of House of Lords? I mean, how the power sharing between those two chambers?
Well,
what are the privileges they have?
For something to be approved, it had to pass both houses. But lords in general tended to be more conservative, particularly in olden days, when they would support the king. It wasn't, there weren't that many disputes. I mean, unless there was a dispute about who was going to be king, and then all bets were off. But someone like, say, Henry V probably didn't have much trouble convincing his lords to support him when he wanted to, go off and invade France, because that's how you gained wealth, right? You gained land. If you had to, you pillaged, but ultimately what you really wanted was to gain land. It was only after nobles started raising sheep and serfdom was abolished and capitalist market relations began to spread in the countryside that that money eventually became more important than land as a source of wealth. If you could make money investing or in raising sheep and selling the wool, there was no reason to go off to France in heavy armor and campaign and all the rest of it. Why not just sit back and let the profits roll in? And basically, that's the transformation that occurred in the 16th century, between Henry VIII to Elizabeth's time. There's a wonderful quote that I love from Hilary Mantel's second novel on Thomas Cromwell. These are thoughts of Cromwell. But chivalry's day is over. One day soon, moss will grow in the tilt yard. The days of the moneylender have arrived, and the days of the swaggering privateer. Banker sits down with banker, and kings are their waiting boys.
I just wonder, as a result of this revolution, why didn't they abolish House of Lords at all?
Well, that's a very interesting question. In fact, they did in 1649, but that came later. What I was describing was the political unity between the Atlantic merchants, who were probably who were very important leaders, not the only ones, but very important leaders of the middling class Puritan movement, and the gentry. If that alliance hadn't existed, they would have had to fight on their own. The House of Commons and the gentry, who were still part of the aristocracy, but let us say had become bourgeoisified, if you will, gave them political cover. This was, to them a good thing. And traditionally, of course, the House of Commons had been where opposition to the monarchy resided, as we were just talking about. But in France, in 1789, see, it was quite different. The aristocracy in France did not invest in trade or anything else. They were simply landlords. They could impose their own taxes. That was their source of wealth and prestige. So that in 1789, the split between the bourgeoisie, or the third estate, and the aristocracy was explosive, far more so than in England. And the class lines were much clearer as a result. England had this skew. When the Jacobins came in 1793, what they initiated was a reign of terror against the aristocracy. Now, eventually went off the rails, but its purpose was, in a moment of deep crisis, to defend the French Republic against the aristocracy and the other their friends and relations in the other countries surrounding France. I mean, all these, the whole European aristocracy were all related to each other. That didn't happen in England, right? Because it would have meant a reign of terror against the gentry, who were nominally on the side of the revolution, or at least close enough. And in fact, the House of Commons did split over the issue. A majority did go through with the revolution against the king in London in 43, but not all of them. There was a very sizable minority that refused. They didn't want anything to do with this. They either tried to stay neutral if they could, or some of them just went over to royalism, because they weren't going to associate with porters and drapers and I've got some wonderful quotes here, from people talking about how awful it is, how awful these people are, and how unimportant, and sneering at them. They didn't want to be associated with these people in any way, shape, or form. And that's what split the House of Commons in 43. And so they went off, and about 200, little more, of the gentry and the commons went forward with the revolution.
Michael, we have a question from Olga.
Right.
Olga, go ahead.
Okay, hi. I have a question. Probably I don't know if you want or can to answer. It's like, do you see any similarities between situation that you describing and what is going right now in the United States? And if yes, to at what stage? If no, then why?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. There are not very many similarities. The greatest similarity is that they are both societies in decay. But other than that, they're quite different. Given the long time period between them, how could it not be so? The 17th century revolutions took place at a time when feudalism was dying, which made capitalism a progressive step forward, and eventually allowed, of course, for an enormous increase in the economy and in economic production. That would never have occurred if it hadn't been for the capitalist or bourgeois revolution. Spain, for example, in the 17th century declined. It was no longer the power it had been. Its population declined 18% during the 17th century. The situation in America today is interesting. Yes, I would argue that we live in a capitalist society in decay. Capitalism is no longer progressive and hasn't been for a long time. But the question of how and when and that can be remedied is a very thick and thorny one. And I'm not going to go into it here. At least, I have my own opinions, of course, but, it's very unfortunate that people don't see a real alternative, for example, to the two major parties. Trevor Noah had a line that I rather liked. He said, "Why do we want to vote for Biden? Just because he knows how a mask works." So it's, I don't want to get off the topic really, but that's about as much as I can say right now.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question. It's more historical. I also read that what is drive industrialization in England, it was that cotton became very fashionable in Europe.
I'm sorry, what did?
And
Cotton became very fashionable.
Fashionable, and it's also somehow affected slavery and slave trade in the United States. But all this cotton went actually to England to produce whatever they produced. And it was extremely expensive and very popular among upper classes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about it more than I said?
Well, yes. I mean, cotton during the 19th century was certainly exported from America, from the American South to England. It was why there was a danger of England interceding on the side of the South. One of the things that prevented that was the workers in, I believe, Bristol, who were on the side of the North because they hated slavery, and they were associated, I believe, with Karl Marx's First International, and they went on strike. They worked in mills, and they went on strike for something like 2 years to prevent, in sympathy with the anti-slavery struggle, and to prevent the English government from interceding into the American War.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anybody else, any other questions? I'm not gonna call names, but anybody has any additions?
Yeah, could I have another question. Just the question is like, why did they allow restoration? Did Charles II had more powers than Charles I or less?
He had less.
Much less, right?
Star Chamber and High Commission never came back. Charles II was in the very peculiar position that for the first time in English history, the king had not called Parliament. Parliament had called the king. So that was a bit of a different story. It wasn't possible to turn back the clock completely, any more than Mary Tudor could undo the Reformation of Henry VIII, her father. A lot of people.
Why they allowed this to happen at all? Why did they invite?
Well, very briefly, Cromwell died in 1658, and over the next well, initially his son was made protector, who was not Oliver. He had no connection to the military. He had never fought in the war. He was generally just kind of an incompetent. He shouldn't have been in politics at all. But he was the eldest son, so they made him Lord Protector. Anyway, he only survived about 9 months. The army tried to rule on its own. That wasn't successful. They called back the original Long Parliament before it was purged in 48. And finally, one of Cromwell's former generals, who had an army in occupation of Scotland, simply decided enough was enough, and he marched south and basically forced the issue, and the Long Parliament then invited the king to return. You have to remember that the Civil War, which lasted 7 years, was enormously destructive, took quite a while to recover from. The first few years under the Republic, or Commonwealth as it was called, they were very cold. There were bad harvests. The Council of State had to import grain to alleviate starvation. It was really an incredibly difficult period. While there were certain advances that occurred, it was basically a degenerating situation that had been held together by the personal authority and prestige of Oliver Cromwell.
So it's for the lack of leadership that it happened.
Yes, lack of leadership.
No leader emerged to continue.
And there was no longer a revolutionary movement per se, because Cromwell had put an end to it.
On top of that, they wanted to get rid of a monarchy, which by its nature is just using people within its own family to rule. And then they had his son become a protector. So they set up basically what was like a monarchy. So it didn't get meritorious in any way. It didn't become a meritocracy. It didn't change anything.
No, it didn't. The situation degenerated, exactly. And they, because they didn't have of any kind of vision of where to go forward, they simply fell back on old traditions and,
almost
this happened almost immediately. They resurrected when ambassadors came to first present their credentials to Cromwell, they used the exact same rituals or procedures or protocols, that's the word I need, as had been used under the king. So, you know, there was this entire lack of political foresight, in part because as Puritans, they simply kind of believed that, oh, you know, once we get rid of the king, the kingdom of Jesus will appear and take over. Millennialism was very rife, almost an orthodoxy on the parliamentary side. So they looked to their religion for solutions, and guess what? They didn't find any.
Okay. Anyone else have questions, or are we ready to close it up?
Just one question. What do you see as the influence of this on the later American Revolution?
Well, the reform as I said at the beginning, the reform program of the Gentry was eventually codified in the American Bill of Rights. It wasn't a direct, simple, oh yeah, let's write this down, right? I mean, it was John Locke was one of the guys who sailed with William of Orange in 1688 to England. He was there.
Do you think there was a sense of the Americans wanting to avoid what happened with Cromwell, of the occurrence of a dictatorship, and we're saying, okay, we want the change, but we have to figure out some way to steer the boat down the middle of the channel?
Well, maybe. I'm not sure. You have to, 1688 was not totally unimportant. And my guess is they probably looked to that more than they did to 1640. But because for one thing, 1688, all of the issues that 1688 was fought about were exactly the same as in 1640, because during Charles II's reign, he became more and more conservative, more and more absolutist to the extent that he could. And when he died in 85, his brother James, became James II, he was an open Catholic, and he was determined to restore Catholicism to England and to restore absolutism to England. And so all of the same issues that were fought over in the Civil War suddenly were resurrected by James II. Now, he only lasted 3 years, but that was what he was attempting to do. And it's interesting because the guys who are now fighting him from Parliament are the sons of all the guys who were in Parliament in the 1640s and 50s. And in 1 or 2 cases, they were the same guys if they had been young enough in the 40s. So I suspect the Americans were looking more toward 1688 because it was more foundational for the current British state than 1640 was. But yeah, many of the issues, if you read the Federalist papers, many of the issues are, really got their start in the mid 17th century events.
Do it have any effect on the French Revolution? If that's the case, Robespierre and
yeah, sure, because these same, well, they were more directly
Execution of the king would be one.
They were more directly affected by the Americans. They didn't particularly. They didn't like the English Revolution. I'm not sure exactly why. For some reason, it didn't appeal to them. They probably didn't really understand it. But they were directly affected by the American Revolution.
And the Americans were horrified when the French
Oh yeah.
Guillotine the king. They were horrified by that. They were really freaked out by it. They didn't expect, they didn't want that. They at first felt, yes, this is great, but when they saw the mobs and the final denouement there, they were quite horrified.
And the queen.
And the queen.
Yeah, who was like non-participant of this.
What's his name? Who's the Tom Paine? Tom Paine, in America was a leading radical. He went to France, I think in '92. He was a moderate.
He was actually imprisoned by the directorate and thought his head was going to be chopped off at any moment. He wrote a book then, which is not very well known, but called The Age of Reason, in which he basically he declares basically a kind of a fundamental tract of deism, the notion that the creation is the universal work of God, speaks to all men. And that's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is the most vicious attack on Christianity, on the mythology of Christology, of the virgin birth, the whole thing. It was, and I think it made him an untouchable in American politics. They were very happy to let him kind of just disappear and not make him, not canonize him as a founder of the Republic.
Yes, and George Washington was very aware and very careful to never look like a king, not in any way, shape, or form.
That's why
he
they
really
call
wanted
them,
nothing to do with that.
That's why they call them American Cincinnatus, right?
Yeah, he didn't want anything to do with that.
Right, Cincinnatus went back home to his farm.
Right, yeah.
Right, he didn't, yes, exactly. He didn't want anything to do with that at all. And that was very interesting, because that was something that would be brought up in the beginning of our country, the nascent part of our country. Well, is it starting to get like a king? I mean, how do we even name our leader? That was like a big deal. What do we call this person?
So,
because we don't want to sound like it's a king. We want to stay away from that as far as possible. They just really were afraid of it.
By the way, you know that the city Cincinnati was called in honor of Washington.
Cincinnati, because he was Cincinnati.
Yeah, and they called it.
Could we want to just redirect this back to the question I raised about Puritanism? And it just seems to me that there's just, maybe that's one of the major differences between the English Revolution and the French. That these experiences of particular spreading literacy has a democratizing effect. It has a social mobility effect that Catholicism just never had. Just any thoughts that you have on that?
I mean, you have to read your own Bible, right? For the Protestants.
Exactly, and you don't for the Catholics.
Yes, that's right.
No, we didn't have masses not in Latin until the 1968. I don't remember, the Vatican
But
II.
even if they would have known, they wouldn't be allowed to read it.
And yeah.
Unless you priest.
So is there a correct statement if you can say Eastern Church or Orthodoxy was much more progressive since they read the Bible in Cyrillics earlier than it was given to the Western part of the world, I guess?
Well, the context there was extended serfdom. So I don't think you can say that it was a more progressive tendency.
Right. No, I was just saying that they're allowed to speak in, they're allowed to read in their own language versus Latin was,
Yeah, but look at the overwhelming impoverishment of Russia.
Right. I mean, literacy was interesting. At one time, one second, Greg. One time there was a comment was passed that in Byzantium, a shepherd would be more educated than somebody in Carolingian bureaucracy. A shepherd was much highly educated in a certain time in the thousands than in. That's how far the western part of the world was behind the eastern part because of the destruction of the Roman Empire, which we'll get to all that stuff. Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I already forgot what I wanted to say.
I'm
It's
sorry.
okay, no big deal. It wasn't that
All
important.
right, I just want to get on with this schedule quickly, just to name it quickly. So we have Sunday next week. We have Teutonic Knights, and Sergio is going to invite his friends. So I don't know if they're going to do a battle. I expect a night battle, so we'll see. Maybe one is going to be Nevsky per your request, Paul, and one is going to be Teutonic Knight. We'll see. They have to have ice though. There's no ice. And then we'll have Nagorno-Karabakh on the Wednesday 11th, which is next week. I mean the following week. Then we have a history of foreign exchange, Forex, and James is going to help me with that. Classical Athens, it's me and Greg. Greg mostly is going to do work. I'm just going to provide the visuals with him. And then I'm going to present Josephus Flavius, which is part of our ancient text. Rich is going to present creation of Israel, creation of state of Israel, and it's going to be on the 22nd. And Peloponnesian War, Sergio and Aaron is going to do that. So we have a full field November.
A couple of quick things. So the Second and the Eighth Amendments in the Constitution are very directly connected to the glorious revolution, and so there's a pretty interesting relationship there. The English duty of service in the militia and in posse comitatus. So basically imposing these relationships between state and individual, and within the within the Glorious Revolution, one of the compromises was that individuals kept the right to keep and bear arms, and then the Eighth Amendment, which is the right of having bail and not having onerous bail imposed, that was directly tied into 1688 and 1689. So there's some very, and we don't really ever study any of this stuff, right? When I mean us, it's like, news or anything, even New York Times, like nobody really draws that straight line back, that this wasn't just sort of random and arbitrary. These were considered mechanisms, right, to grant, the power to the population, and the population grants rights to the state. I think that's one thing that we often tend to forget about all of these political revolutions, was just the inversion of the power relationship, and trying to recreate sort of new balances, between that.
Yeah, let me just throw in and direct your attention following that to the Federalist Papers number 29 and 46. If you're interested, they both talk about militias, and you may find some very surprising stuff there.
Great. Why don't you just indicate what that might be? Don't leave us hanging.
Well, they both Madison and Hamilton argued that the militias, which they called citizens with arms, were the guarantee of the people's liberties, even against the federal government if necessary. Now, their conception was, that this would take place within the context of the states, because they saw the states sort of analogous to the counties of 17th century England. But they're quite clear that, you don't need, because there were a lot of fears about, domination by the federal government, and it would become too powerful and all the rest of it. And they were saying, oh, no, at most the federal government might have 10,000 people, but, there are 50,000 of you guys, who all have rifles at home. You'd be able to take, do this, take them on with no problem. So,
yeah.
But this idea of the militia being the people's guarantee of their own liberties and taking responsibility for themselves as citizens is quite impressive.
Yeah, and a lot of that's tied, or let's put it this way, a lot of its theoretical foundation was tied to the English revolutions, but then the implementation of British colonial acts, the Proclamation Act in 1763, Sugar Act in 64, Stamp Act, and I think 65, Quartering Act. So basically in England they passed, in a tiny amount of time, these, very onerous acts that really changed all the relationship of centralization of power, in the colonies. So the colonies acted, really as a tributary state almost, and that really, I think that sort of jet fueled it, right? I sort of added like an accelerant to, like lighter fluid, to how our founders rewrote the Constitution, or wrote the Constitution, or the Articles of Confederation, and then ultimately the Constitution, to reflect that massive devolution of power from the center. And I think that's something that, we don't necessarily, we kind of take for granted. It's, like we sort of have this, I think, very 20th century, which makes sense because this is the world we lived in, the 21st century view, that it's almost like the country is new, with all the legal architecture, instead of this inheritance over 200-300 years. And then when we don't like something that is there, we think that, well, just move those things around and you can kind of get the outcome that you want. And of course, that's number one, you can't really do that. It doesn't really work. But number two, it's got so much precedent like integrated into it that it becomes very, very challenging to sort of, manipulate the constitutional intent. And, and I think that's why the English Revolution is so, I think, fundamental.
Another thread that we might want to keep in mind is the relationship between the Puritans and the stream of New England abolitionists.
Absolutely.
Because that's where they all come from. And that, in this question of state power versus federal power, I think one might advance the argument that the real decisive thing was the Civil War, that this was the federal government demonstrating that it could keep these states together, and the role of, certainly there was an important catalytic role that the abolitionists played in bringing the philosophical issues to the front and keeping that and tying it to biblical precedent and morality.
Well, you had the destruction of the Whig Party, which is really just sort of an evolution from England, and that created the Free Soil Party, which then created the Republican Party, right? So you just had this, and the abolitionists were absolutely essential to that, because they basically did not want compromise. They didn't want compromise at the formation of the country to begin with, and that just stayed there, and sort of just evolved out, so almost like emanated out from the original abolitionists from the 1750s, 60s, 70s, 80s. As that thought had really been seeded, it just kept growing, and eventually it crushed one of the political parties, and that's how you got the Republican Party ultimately. But was through the Free Soil Party, which was sort of the red line, really, in a lot of ways. There was no compromise there at all. And there's these very interesting sort of relationships that that a lot of people don't know about. So like General Grant's dad was the senior apprentice for John Brown's dad. Goes back to the 1810s and 20s, and they were called pure abolitionists. So that's like the founders had. This was like a Christian. This is really like a Christian sect that said, the people who do this slavery need to be destroyed and punished, like wrath of God millennialists, like almost back to the Gnostics, and sort of like the view of the first century, second century Christians. And so there was obviously no negotiating with them. And so that it was a very, this was there much earlier than people sort of perceive. It wasn't in the 1850s that was sort of like, oh wow, you know, let's sort of deal with it now. It just it built into this movement really, you know, that really took over a large part of the North, you know, philosophically. And they knew it was going to be a civil war. I mean, this wasn't like I mean, that's why they were stockpiling arms for 50 years, you know, which people don't realize actually.
Yeah, many of the abolitionists were extreme religious radicals.
Exactly.
Like the Grimke sisters and, you know, so many others. To your point about taxation, yeah, this is really key because, and this is exactly why the tax question was so critical in the 1640s, because in a capitalist economy, if you can't control taxes, you can't pay soldiers. And of course, control of soldiers is control of state power. You know, this is simply this is something very new at the time. You know, previously, you just whoever, you know, lived on your land and, you know, your vassals and so on, in the old feudal manner, you just, oh well, the Lord said we have to go follow the king, so I guess we're going to France. You know, not anymore. That no longer was good enough.
Yeah, and one of the more interesting things, if you want to read about the relationship of the abolitionist, was in 1780, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed the act for the gradual abolition of slavery, which basically guaranteed that it's the first time in human history that a democracy passed a law to abolish slavery at that point. And it basically created this jurisdiction that eliminated it. And of course that ran into a direct conflict because our capital was in Philadelphia by 1790. And so, you know, there was this, I mean, you know, you read these stories. I mean, it's just the intensity. It's actually remarkable that we didn't blow apart back then. It really is. You could just see how combustible it was, and it was all built around slavery. I mean, you know, all that combustion because of the Christian radicals, basically, that were the founders of the abolitionist movement, which goes back to the Puritans, obviously.
So, Aaron, I take it you want to do the American Revolution?
Yeah, I'll do that. I mean, what would be interesting to do is maybe segregate that to two different, or split that, probably wrong choice of words there, but split that to two different pieces. One is sort of the, you know, the chronological, you know, history, battles, all that stuff, and the personalities, and another one is the underlying sort of legalism, which would be fun maybe if I don't know if you're up for it, Michael, but we could kind of draw some connection, right, from the English radicals into the American radicals, and you know, we can kind of build on this as a kind of a continuation, because I think, you know, to me, I'm not saying that the war and all this stuff is great. Obviously, it's a foundation of a country, but to me, the ideas are so unique in history, and that's sort of a lot of fun there too. So if someone's up for, or, you know, if you'd like to see it split like that, I'd love to do it that way.
Yeah, I mean,
into some Pacific version of the American Revolution, which I'm okay with. I mean, I'll do the Civil War, I'll do all these things. So if you want,
yeah.
Let me say that one of the things, Michael, that I enjoyed so much about your presentation was it wasn't about battles. It was about essentially this very, very complicated political evolution, which was very confusing, and you unraveled it in a really understandable way. And I'd really love to see that same approach given to talking about the roots of the American Revolution. So, you know, so I'm more interested in, you know, let's say 1750 to 1776 than I am in 1776 to 1781, if you will.
Yeah, and that's how I was thinking that if you want me to do something like that, and Michael, if you want to jump in, or anyone else, that was sort of how I was thinking about it from like an evolutionary standpoint, which is not treating it as these sort of demarcation lines, right? These sort of arbitrary hard lines, but just looking at it as a continuation of what was going on in England, because to the English, these were American, these American colonies was like a brand name for them. It was not like these were the Americas that were separate, right? Because we weren't separate. So the ideas were this continuation, and we didn't really trigger a lot of that separatism until really the late 1760s, or 50s and 60s. And then one conflict I definitely want to do at some point is the French-American War. It's absolutely the least studied, and it was a global war, right? You could argue it was one of the first world wars.
French-American?
I mean, I'm sorry, the French-Indian. I'm sorry, that's French-Indian War. Yeah. So the French-Indian War, which we don't sort of, we tend to just pass over, not just the United States, I think everywhere. But when you look at the conflict, the scale of it, across the whole, everybody that was part of it, it's pretty, and I think it laid a lot of seeds to the ideas that a lot of early founders had about how much of an imperial power they didn't want us to be, right? They really didn't want us to get sucked into just these sort of perpetual colonial imperialistic kind of conflicts all over the world and just weaken ourselves. In some ways they had an idealistic view of this sort of pristine, simple, internalized state, which of course was never going to happen either. But I think there's something there that I think is pretty fascinating when you kind of link all that together.
I mean, we had a great resource that nobody else had, which was the whole expanse of the country heading to the west.
That's right.
Right. So we had alternatives that were not available to the Europeans.
Exactly. Well, and many times they called this, right? We use words like New World, but many times they called it New Europe, or their version of what Europe meant to them. They viewed this as just this sort of extension with just an ocean in between.
I'm actually interested, and this might be weird, at some point do a biology of people. Like, for example, Kosciuszko, however you guys pronounce it. He was such a character, right? He was a general in Civil War, and he went to defend Poland during the
Revolutionary War.
Revolutionary War. Sorry, Revolutionary. Then he went to defend, Poland, and versus Suvorov, who was a Russian general. It was an interesting character. I mean,
we had tons of characters. I mean, that's the thing that made the Revolutionary War here so wild, is that it was like a magnet for, and we had that sort of, you'd almost call it entrepreneurialism 1.0, which was political entrepreneurialism, right? And it just attracted, you look at the leadership cadre that Washington built. I mean, there was, there were Prussians, there were French. I mean, there were basically treasonous English. I mean, it was just like a grab bag across the board. Or there were some Russians. I mean, it was just this sort of grab bag revolutionary army, which was about getting the best ideas, and he gave power to non-native, non-organically native leaders in a way that it's almost unheard. I mean, you almost have to go back to the ancient world, because of the concept of sort of the nationalistic identities that people have around, whatever their country is or their people are. And a lot of it came down to his version, Washington and many of his top commanders' version of meritocracy. I mean, the way they understood meritocracy to be. And they needed to innovate against the English, because the English were a monster, right? I mean, you had the biggest naval and army power coming over to eat up this small ragtag army. So you weren't, beggars weren't going to be choosers.
I mean, we definitely have an appetite for a different history, any kind of history. And if there is an interest in certain aspect like English Revolution, there was major interest. And then obviously we haven't touched on to the, Henry and then all the other, stuff. And we're going to do French Revolution, all that stuff. And we have tip of the iceberg, but we took a really big.
Oh, it's great. This was great.
We're biting a big,
Huge.
Huge. And
Huge.
that's why we have a chronology in our ancient part. And then we haven't even dived into the Rome yet. It's going to be as a whole that we won't be able to fill.
Yeah, that's a year.
Yeah. It's a year, yeah. And then we haven't even touched on Egypt. Egypt is going to be probably 2 years from now. I mean, that's
really all of Africa, really, for that matter.
I mean, all Africa, Egypt, and we haven't gone to the East yet, except the Pacific War a little bit, but nothing crazy. I mean, we haven't done any of that stuff. We definitely need to sprinkle some to make it interesting, and that's why I thank you, Michael.
Oh, this was great.
This was great because it's completely, it's different to what we're talking about World War II. We're talking about, but we haven't really talked about what affected this country, right? And England is obviously what the source of all the grief, so to speak.
And I think one of the things that's very interesting, and I mean, an area that I've just started getting into more is this sort of philosophical collision between, let's say French radicals, English radicals, American radicals, obviously at different sort of time slices, but and their sort of beliefs in what quote unquote the right revolution means, and it's to me that's really fascinating, right? Because the French had a extremely radical vision in terms of the definition of what their revolution really meant. I mean, it's arguably probably the most comprehensive social revolution that anyone's ever really attempted, and because it just was about every piece of society, you know what I mean, every layer, because it's like they wanted to impose this concept of equality, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a social standpoint, economic, everything. And I think the English and the Americans took a more, hands-off, mercantilistic sort of first approach, which is why we have, I think, a structure the way we do. And that's why, France, there's an old saying in France that I've been reading about, which is, all decisions, if you need an important decision, you have to go to Paris, because there's just incredible concentration and centralization of power. And that lasts to this day, which, I mean, I sort of understood that at a, whatever, you hear it on TV level, but when you really see how it sort of implemented, so our revolution was really an antithesis to, in a lot of ways, to the French Revolution.
Right. And French was also always an aggressor, except when it came to, Kaiser. I mean,
and the French viewed themselves as an antithesis to the English Revolution, because they view the English Revolution, I think, that it wasn't just that it was incomplete, but that it solidified the interests and the powers and sort of the hierarchies in place. It didn't, which they believed you couldn't get to an equality, which was one of the key tenets of the French Revolution, without basically blowing all that away. So,
I mean, one thing I wanted to do, guys, if you don't mind, on a meetup or somewhere in YouTube channels, which I'm going to post, to throw in, recommended readings that people can go into the Goodreads and then pick up a book or Audible that, people read on this stuff, because we're going to definitely continue in this subject matter as well. Whatever you guys were saying today as well, I can kind of pick up and also post it and as well. But in the comment sections, provide the good reads. Okay, this is good about English Revolution. This is good about Henry VIII and stuff like that. So all that stuff that we're going to present, Sparta, anything we're presenting, any kind of read recommendations, because people keep asking, how do I prepare for this? I don't know, what to really tell them, except go and, listen to a certain, podcast or read this book that I know, but obviously my volume of books is not the same level as yours, guys.
One of my hacks, just so everyone knows, because I tend to really like academic papers, as if any of you've seen in my links I've sent for 5 months. One reason is you don't have to read the whole thing. Usually the first the summary and the first chapter to just, have to justify the thesis or, that someone has or some published paper. But number one, they're almost all free. And the hack is you put your question in, you try to put it in a question that sort of makes sense from how someone would put it into a topic. And then in Google, you go to format. Like, so when you go to Google, you can go to advanced after you do a search, and then go to format, and then go to format for PDF. And if you format for PDF, there's almost no paper that matters that someone hasn't put into a PDF form. So then what that'll do is just, blast all those PDFs that are around that topic. So if you do, English, contrast English, compare English Revolution to American Revolution, something like that. You do PDF, then you'll get, this laundry list, whatever.
I'll just tell you, Aaron, that my experience is very different when it comes to the ancient world, which is the place that I research. So, so I don't, I don't know the others, but you'll get a lead on Google, and you click into it, and the whole bottom will be grayed out, and it'll say that they're all behind a paywall.
Well,
I have access to it because I'm a graduate of Columbia, and so I have lifetime access to the library, and through the Columbia Library portal, I get to all of the academic papers.
So
Can I send you requests, Paul?
What's that?
Can I send you requests?
Yes, repeat no. So send them to me, but I didn't tell you that.
All right.
So there are free research publications that are out there, like ResearchNet, that gives you a pretty solid. You don't get everything, but whatever, it's a third. And remember, for a lot of our topics, we don't need, we're not doing a PhD, right? So we don't need the defense bibliography. But what I found is that if you put the keys, you have to put in the PDF as the format. That's the key, because you don't tend to get. And then you learn, like he was saying, about which ones have paywalls, which they're obviously which journals that you can't do it that Paul was talking about. But there is quite a bit out there. I mean, I dig up. I'd say that's where I get 90% of my information from, to be honest.
The other thing is that, you read so many books where you say, well, I really wish the author would have just, left his paper intact, because he doesn't really have much more to say than he had in a 30-page paper. And it's just repetition and padding and so forth. So the papers tend to get right to the point, and they're, so I really do enjoy reading papers more than books.
Yeah. And like I said, especially the history ones, and sometimes, and I'd say you get access to about a big number of theses, which I find better than the dissertations. The dissertations are just, like you said, basically a bad book. Whereas the master's theses, number one, they tend to be more readable. The person isn't, 10 years into their academic career. No offense to anyone here that's PhD. But you tend to still have that very, classroom stage of learning and discussion, which is, often where we are. And so
don't shortchange the importance of the bibliography.
No, of course not. Of course not.
The bibliography is what takes you on the treasure hunt.
Yep.
Absolutely.
But my point is, I'm sorry, Michael, to just tell you, I want that educated, almost a listener, because, like if people, I've read a lot before coming on to Michael's, presentation, and it's just the way it is. Sometimes, you come in with a kind of like an open mind and you will receive all that. But also when you educate yourself, read a little bit about the subject matter, even Google it or listen to a podcast, it's already much more interesting, because like, oh, this makes sense. This doesn't make sense. Okay, how do I, ask this question? You sound a little more intelligent, or you can ask questions that, make sense, stuff like that. So that's why prior to any kind of presentation we could give, we could just throw a couple of books as like recommendation or a couple of papers. Like, guys, read this if you guys want to refer to something. Because I've been getting so many questions like, how do we prepare for any kind of presentation? They're feeling like there's going to be a quiz at the end. There's not going to be a quiz at the end, but still, people want to sound and smart and understand this better. Go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
No, I was just going to suggest that Aaron, maybe you and maybe others could, put a list of resources,
Sure.
Online resources, because you've mentioned several along the way. I don't know, either on the website or
Yeah,
or someplace we can get at.
Hey, I mean, if you want, I can do, maybe we set up after next week or whatever, I can do like a 15-minute, just hands-on, just show you guys how I do these searches and just kind of, and I mean, without knowing what you're going to ask me for. So that'll be the key. So this will be a blind search. So we'll do it. You ask me for a topic and I'll share my screen, and then you'll just, and I'll kind of hack my way through it. And you can kind of see how I did it, and then get to these papers that you can use.
Well, if we have time, that's fine.
Yeah.
But, a list. I mean, I use JSTOR a great deal, and a couple of others, ProQuest. But if you some of these, I'm sure there are more out there, and if we share them around, it would be to everyone's benefit.
Sure, absolutely. What I tend to do though is sort of topical, like within the specific topic, because at this point I've been doing this like 20 years like this. So it's like I have my own web crawler of my brain. And so, I can kind of show you how I do that, and you can kind of see, just what's out there and just how easy it is. I mean, if you got 2 minutes, I can show it to you right now. I mean, it's pretty easy.
No, I mean, we'll drop. I mean, we'll make it so that one of my presentations, maybe on Forex or something like that.
Yeah.
By the way, just to give you warn you guys, a little bit on Forex, we will be doing a little bit of trading. So if just come with an open mind, I'll pull up the MP4, which is the software that's used to trade pairs or cross pairs of currencies, US dollar versus JPY or whatever. And then we will be doing live trading. Shit you not. So this is going to be hands-on. And I want to have at least once in a while something that we could really benefit. Maybe we'll do like Fibonacci rule or something like that. And some mathematician who also knows math will talk about Fibonacci rule, because it's applied everywhere. Like anything you do is Fibonacci. It's crazy. And, so we could just do that. And look, I see Michael smiling, Mikhail smiling.
Yeah,
So
I'll tell you why. What about making a pool of money?
well, we're going to have to, we have to get alchemist here. That's going to convert. Yeah, I mean, I will teach you how to make money. Why not?
Be careful you don't get thrown off. You don't violate YouTube's rules or something.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I have to go. Thank you
guys.
very much,
Nice
Michael.
one.
I really, really enjoyed it. See you
Have a nice one. Thank you, Michael, and everybody. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank
This
you.
is awesome.
Bye. Bye.
So, you're there still? Or
I'm
no?
still here. I'm here. What's up?
Are you done recording, or you still recording?
I'm going to stop right now.
Oh, cool. No, I didn't.